Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my Lunch and Learn. This is my Lunch and Learn on hooks. I'm a really big fan of hooks. I really like the way that they are implemented, and I'm hoping to persuade you all into implementing them into your own code base. So let's take a look. This is the overview. Just going to go through it pretty quickly here. The brief history timeline of hooks. React as a JS framework has been very early since its release in May 2013. These other nodes are other important dates where React has implemented some ease of use for its code base. People that are familiar with React might notice a lot of these as givens, but these have only been released in the past couple of years. So just bringing that to your attention that this has been a very relatively short timeline for React as a framework, and that just kind of talks to its user base and how well everybody maintains it. The hooks specifically, the purpose of them are a couple of these main points. They are React features without classes, state, and a lot of other useful things that you thought you could only use within a class component, you can now use within a function component. It definitely focuses code use through cutting down code and the focus of its intent. Those two things together are very, very important, especially with larger code bases. Being able to quickly identify and understand what it is that you're looking at and what the programmer is attempting to do are two really important things about hooks. And lastly, you can refactor them at your own pace. You can use them in conjunction with class components in terms of having like one part of your code base be functional components and then having like a larger, more complex class component that you're not entirely ready to refactor yet. It doesn't break anything in that regard. So let's go to the next slide. This is just a screenshot that I took of a traditional class component. You can kind of see how big it is and how scattered its focus and its intent is. The blue is the state, and the purple is kind of the listeners and things that are on update. You can see that down there at the bottom, the orange or the reddish orange is where the actual return render is for the component. In the next slide here, we take that same focus of intent and we condense it into these very easy to understand boxes. You can see that all the squares are a lot more centralized and focused so that you definitely know where logic is coming from. This is that same component turned into a functional component with hooks. You can definitely see that it's a lot pared down and focused, which is really good for code understanding. Rules of hooks. These are the three main rules of hooks. You only call hooks at the top level. Do not call them inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. A way to deal with this is typically to put your logic inside of the hook itself. There are some examples of that in the React docs that might be able to help you understand how to make a more complex hook if you need to call it somewhere else. Only call hooks from React functions. You can only use them inside of React. That's pretty much a given. And then they're only used in function components. They cannot be used in class components. That's another given. Those are the three main focuses of them. So today, I'm hoping to focus on these four hooks. If you go to the link at the bottom, you'll definitely see that there's about 6 more that I didn't add to this today, just for brevity and focus of understanding hooks. I believe that with this presentation, you'll be able to understand the ones that I might not have included today. Let's see, I'll go through them and just talk about them briefly. useState is the most basic of the hooks. It's just the starter hook, and that's the one we're going to start with today, just to really get an understanding of what hooks do in terms of using state. useEffect is a way to create side effects within your code. It definitely tries to take over the logic that component did update or will update is using and use to that effect. useMemo and useCallback, these are a little bit more advanced. They are just code that helps you memorize values or functions, um, mostly used for performance issues or keeping functions or values that are created through a lot of computational work, so that you don't have to constantly recompute them. And then useReducer. This is React's hook that is trying to be more like Redux reducers. Once you take a look at that last one, I think you'll get a better understanding of what it's attempting to do. But these are the four that we're going to focus on today. And hopefully from this presentation, you'll get a better understanding of hooks and how to use them. Here we go. Woo! So understanding useState, returns a stateful value and a function to update it. This is just a very simple example of useState. Up on line 5, you can see that count and set count are coming from useState. And then in line 9, you return count, and line 10 uses a function to take count and increase it by 1. I'm going to explain this a little bit more. I just take a moment to look at that and see where it's coming from, let it wash over you, understand a little bit of the hook. Honestly, like the majority of everything coming from the hook is line 5, surprisingly. That like really condenses a lot of what's happening in this example and lets you see that like the value is being computed very simply. I guess one extra thing to add to that is that inside of useState itself, that 0 is the initial value that you set for it. That's definitely something to remember when using hooks. And you can set it to 0, null, another number that you compute somewhere else, any of those values. And it also does not only have to be used with numbers, for sure. Let's talk a little bit more about this. So how it works is you take, with array deconstructing, you can take the first values of an array as variables. So in line 1 and 2, you just see that X is the array, Y and Z are variables coming from that array. And if you console log those out, you get 1 and 2. So using that same logic, we're just taking 2 variables out of the useState function, which returns an array. The first value is the state of count, and then the second value is the set state of count. So you can initialize it with a value of 0, count becomes 0, and then you have set count, and you use that function to set a new count state. Advanced usage for using state. There are a lot of things you can do with this one specifically, and I think understanding this one will be the best way of knowing how to use hooks. You can define multiple state variables, all different shapes and sizes. You can use numbers, you can use strings, you can use objects, you can use arrays of objects. Alternatively, you can just define a state object itself down in line 12, and then use a set state function to update the state with a specific value based on a function that you create yourself. These two alternatives are a little bit more advanced, but once you start to understand how easy it is to either set multiple state variables or to create your own entire state object within a hook, the code gets really condensed and really easy to read, especially when you know where the 2 first values in the array are coming from and how to implement them effectively, so that using state will work really well for you. That's pretty much it for useState. There are probably a lot of other more complex functions or functionality that you can do with it, But learning this and understanding that this is possible definitely helps you learn how to use these next hooks coming up. Understanding useEffect. useEffect is a little bit more interesting. By default, effects run after every completed render, but you can choose to fire them only when certain values have changed. So you can create a function without a value, and that value will constantly update no matter what. That's on line 1. But then lines 3 through 5, if you want to do something, it depends on that value inside the array. Let's take a look at an example of it, and I can talk a little bit more about where these values are coming from and how to use them. So this is a practical usage that I pulled from one of the things that I made here at Yeti. This is just scrolling to the top of a window whenever the path name is changed. So on line 8, the path name is the value that is required for the useEffect hook to take effect. And all it does is call the window to scroll up to the top. That's like not much more complex than that. It's a very basic use case. The path name is coming in from the example, and there's some router code that'll keep passing it through. The window function is from JavaScript itself, but being able to call it on every time you change your path is really effective and like really easy to understand just by using this one simple hook, which I really like to see the code being focused just for that and not having to call it on every single route or call it every single function that you have. So it's a really convenient way of using useEffect. So another way to use useEffect is to hook it up to subscriptions. That's one of the things that the React doc says is a really good practical way of using it. So what we do here is we call a function, and inside of that function, we subscribe to a subscription. But when you're done with it, you can return an unsubscribed function, which will be called once the prop source changes. So that is another more advanced way of using useEffect. I think it's just really convenient to be able to do all of this within less than 10 lines of code and just like really understand what's happening inside of those lines without having to explain too much more about what's going on. So that's useEffect. This one a little bit more advanced. useMemo, useCallback. I'm going to stay on this one for a little bit because of the definitions. It's useful to saving memory on big processes by caching the result for useMemo, but useCallback alternatively is useful to save memory on re-renders by caching functions. So they look quite similar, and based on the previous useEffect hook that we looked at, we can kind of see the similarities being expressed between those two. You can see on line 2 that it gets called with a function, and then the two values that are going to change that will cause it to re-render. So that's one way of calling a memoized value, but alternatively, you can call on line 5 the same memoized value without anything in the array, and that will only be called once, regardless of any changes to A or B. Callback, alternatively, is very similar on line 10, and there's a lot of similarities to it, but it returns the function itself and not the value, but it is very similar to useMemo. These have a little bit more rare use case, but it's still nice to know that these exist and to bring attention to them in the event that you are looking to use hooks for memory saving or a more complex example of why you might be using useHook. Practical usage. So this is a random color generator that you can use, and it just is a button that generates a random color, and you just memoize that inside of the button so that you don't always have to compute the random color every time, and you just return the value that you're getting from it. I'll take a few minutes for that one. That one is a little bit more advanced. Not to worry too much about line 5. It's just returning a random string as a color. And then on lines 9 through 15, you just click that button and it is generating a random color. Time out. Cool. Okay, I think I'm doing pretty good on time. That's good. useReducer is the last one here. This will look very obvious to people that have maybe used Redux or reducers before. So I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time on this one as well, just so that I can kind of break down everything that we're looking at here. It accepts a reducer of type states, comma action and new state, and returns the current state paired with a dispatch method. This is the typical logic used inside of a reducer function. On line 1, it initializes with initial state of count 0. And we're gonna we're using that same count example, but as a reducer. That previous useState, now as a reducer, you can see that you can have different actions for the state and different returns for what the actions will do. So on line 3, the reducer is called with the state and the action. Based on the action type, you can either increment or decrement the state count. And if there is an action called that doesn't exist, it'll throw an error. The same counter or a similar counter to the useState counter, we have the constant of state and dispatch on line 15, and the useReducer that calls the reducer from line 3 and the initial state from line 1. So then it just cycles through being able to either click a minus or a plus and either decrement or increment the state count. This is another very focused way of understanding a useReducer hook, so that you can implement very similar logic to stuff you might have seen before, but more centralized and localized, and understanding where everything might be coming from. So I have a couple of other advanced techniques outside of useReducer. These are some things that you can do in accordance with using hooks and being able to understand a little bit more of the amount of things that you can do while using them. So this one is from the React docs. This is a way of building our own hook. You can see here that lines 2 and line 16, they have the exact same logic for 2 different functions. There's a combination of useState and useEffect to achieve the same solution between these 2 components. One is friend status and one is friends list item. The logic for these 2 hooks are to check if a friend is online, set that they're online, and then use that check to subscribe to a friend status or unsubscribe to a friend status. I'll just go with the top one. Line 2 is useState again. You can see that it's initialized with a value of null for online. And then from there, we use the effect to handle a status change and set is online when they become online. So now what we are going to do with that is just taking that same exact logic from that one hook and turning it into its own function. It takes the same friend ID as before, and it just takes all the same logic that was being used in those 2 components and puts it into its own hook function. Some things to note from this way of doing things is that if you do create your own state hook, they typically are prefixed with the word use. So you can see on line 3, it's called use friend status because it is a hook, and we want to make sure that it's being used appropriately and named appropriately. Nothing is changed in between those lines from 4 to 17, that's all the exact same logic pretty much. The only thing that's changed is that we're using friend ID that was coming from props. Oh, I guess I missed that one. So then you're supposed to insert the hook into components, and it works really well. I forgot that. I forgot that part of the code, I guess, in my presentation. My bad. Cut this part out. Another advanced technique is hooks with TypeScript. At a glance, we're looking at that same reducer function that we saw before, the same counter reducer, but this is with some interface and types. The reducer now has types for it and will throw an error if the type is not correct. This is another, you can see that there's a lot of things that you can do with TypeScript and hooks. Nothing about hooks are not typed currently. There's a state type, there's action type, there's useState type for the useReducer, and all the types in here will be validated and not throw an error unless an invalid action type is created. So yeah, just kind of going more into that. This is a more focused look at the interface and state. You can see that all of the action types are typed and the state is typed. You can increase the amount of values to the state, increase the object signatures and everything like that, and also add more actions to it. This is the reducer itself. It takes in those previous two things that were typed out in line 14 and adds the action type and the state to it. If you were to add more state functions or action types, you could add those inside of the switch statement on line 15. And then the initialization and dispatch right here. 27 is initializing it with its initial state value, and then 29 through 31 are just calling more types or actions to it. So if you call an increment, it'll increment by 1. If you call a decrement, it'll go down by 1. And then you can additionally add an increment amount with the amount to it, and then it'll just add that much to it. That last one is just showing you what happens if you try to dispatch a type that doesn't exist. You'll get a compilation error with a little red squiggly underneath it there. And lastly, these are some third-party hooks. We have a lot, and a lot of them from Redux itself to routers to like UI, UX theming are currently being used. You can also find more just in GitHub, but just these are just a couple of examples of things that are adopting hooks now that are very widely used in React. I think you could make a case that most any React project might have used one of these three things in the past, or a React developer has some familiarity with all three of these third-party libraries. So just bringing attention to the usage of hooks within these as well. Yeah, these are all custom hooks that were made by third-party libraries to hook into the stuff that they were providing originally, and it's just more ease of use, again, code focus, and really being able to understand and implement similar components functionally that you were previously only being able to as classes.